The silence that lasted 20 years. The phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon on September 4th, 1976. The sound startled the quiet of the room more than it should have. The house had grown used to silence. The air inside it carried the kind of stillness that settles into places where laughter used to live but doesn't anymore. Dean Martin sat in his den, a golf tournament playing on television with the volume turned so low it might as well have been a moving painting. He wasn't watching. He hadn't really been watching anything for months. He had developed a habit of letting hours pass without marking them. It was easier that way. No expectations, no performances, no timing to hit. The phone rang again. He almost let it continue. Most calls were business, appearances, invitations, requests to be Dean Martin somewhere for someone. And the world never seemed to run out of places that needed the easy smile and relaxed charm. The third ring made him reach for it. Yeah, Dean. The voice was unmistakable, gravel and velvet at the same time. Frank Sinatra. Dean leaned back in his chair. What do you need, Frank? There was no small talk. With Frank, there rarely was. I need a favor. Dean closed his eyes briefly. Sinatra's favors were rarely small. They usually involved stages, spotlights, and memories he preferred untouched. What kind of favor? Jerry's doing the telethon tonight. The name landed in the room like something fragile being set down too hard. Jerry. For 20 years, that name had existed only in newspaper headlines or passing mentions others quickly regretted making. People learned not to bring him up, and the silence between them had hardened into something close to myth. So, Dean replied evenly, I'm going on later to help with fundraising. I want you to come with me. Dean didn't laugh at first. He just stared at the blank television screen. You're out of your mind. Maybe, Frank said calmly, but I'm still asking. Frank, Dean's voice dropped slightly. We haven't spoken in 20 years. I know. 20. I can count. Dean stood and walked toward the window, looking out over his yard. The afternoon sun washed everything in gold. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. You don't just walk back onto a stage after 20 years, Dean said. Not like nothing happened. Frank's voice softened in a way it rarely did. Life's too short, Dean. That line hung between them. You both built something together, Frank continued. You both lost something together. Don't let pride be the last word. Dean didn't answer. Wear something nice, Frank added. I'll pick you up at 7. The line went dead. Dean stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. 20 years. 20 years since July 25th, 1956, the night at the Copacabana when the partnership officially ended, the night when applause couldn't drown out resentment anymore, the night when two men who had once been inseparable walked in opposite directions. He remembered the early days more clearly than he liked to admit. The Glass Hat Club in 1945. The first time they shared a stage and something electric happened, not rehearsed, not calculated, just chemistry, Jerry bouncing with manic brilliance. The Dean anchoring the chaos with effortless cool. They hadn't planned to become the biggest act in America. They just had. 10 films, radio shows, television, packed theaters, girls screaming, executives begging, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the applause got louder than the friendship. Dean moved back to his chair and turned off the television. He should say no. He should protect what remained of the silence. But beneath the armor of indifference, beneath the years of pretending not to care, something else stirred. Memory. Jerry's laugh, high, uncontrollable, ridiculous. The way Jerry would look at him on stage like a kid who'd just discovered fire. The way they could destroy a room with timing alone. And then the arguments. The interviews that praised one and minimized the other. The slow, the unspoken jealousy neither of them knew how to admit. Dean had told himself he didn't need closure. He had told himself it was cleaner this way. But the truth was less comfortable. He had never stopped wondering. At 6:45 p.m., he stood in front of his mirror adjusting his tie. He looked older than he remembered being. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the posture still relaxed, but the energy quieter. He wasn't walking onto a comedy stage tonight. He was walking into unfinished history. When Frank's car pulled up outside at exactly 7, Dean was already waiting. The drive to the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas was mostly silent. Sinatra didn't push conversation. He knew when a man was fighting something internal. "You don't have to say anything big," Frank finally said as they neared the venue. Dean nodded once. The MDA Labor Day telethon was already deep into its broadcast when they arrived. Cameras everywhere, lights harsh and bright, applause swelling in cycles as performers came and went. Backstage monitors showed Jerry Lewis at center stage. Jerry looked exhausted. 18 hours into hosting, voice strained, eyes red, still pushing, still pleading for donations with that unstoppable drive that had defined him his entire life. Dean watched from the wings, 20 years compressed into seconds. Jerry was older now, gray in his hair, slightly stooped when he thought no one was watching, but the fire was still there. Frank placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. "Ready?" Dean didn't answer. Frank walked out first. The crowd erupted. Jerry smiled wide, embracing Sinatra, grateful for the support. He had no idea what was coming. Frank said a few words about the cause, made a donation, then paused. "I've got a surprise for you, Jerry." The audience leaned forward. Jerry blinked, confused. "Frank, I'm too tired for surprises." "Trust me." Frank turned toward the wings. Dean felt the weight of the moment press into his chest. For 20 years, he had controlled his image carefully. Detached, untouchable, cool. Now, every step toward that stage felt heavier than any spotlight he had ever faced. He walked out. The reaction was not applause at first. It was soundless shock, a collective inhale from thousands of people, 2 decades of silence broken by a single figure crossing the stage. Jerry froze. For a brief second, the telethon, the audience, the cameras, everything disappeared. It was just 2 men staring at each other across 20 years. And Dean stopped a few feet away. Jerry's eyes filled instantly. Dean could feel the tremor in his own hands. The silence stretched. And then he spoke. "I think it's about time, don't you?" 6 words. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, but they carried everything. Jerry broke, not theatrically, not performatively. He stepped forward and pulled Dean into an embrace so tight it nearly threw them both off balance. The audience exploded into applause. But on that stage, for that moment, it wasn't about them. It was about 2 men who had wasted 20 years protecting pride instead of protecting friendship. Dean held on longer than anyone expected him to. The cool exterior cracked, not shattered, but cracked. And through it, something real came through. Oh, what the cameras couldn't capture. The applause inside the Sahara showroom did not fade quickly. It rolled through the room in waves, swelling and crashing, as if the audience understood they were witnessing something far larger than a television segment. Millions were watching from living rooms across America, yet no broadcast could fully contain what was unfolding on that stage. When Dean Martin stepped into the light after 20 years of silence, it was not simply a reunion of entertainers. It was the reopening of something unfinished. The embrace between Dean and Jerry Lewis was long, unpolished, and visibly unplanned. Jerry's shoulders shook with emotion. Dean, whose public image had always leaned toward restraint, did not pull away quickly. For once, there was no performance to maintain. Frank Sinatra stood slightly to the side, satisfied but careful not to intrude. He understood that what mattered now was not celebrity spectacle, but reconciliation. The audience eventually settled enough for Jerry to regain composure. His voice, already strained from hours of hosting, trembled as he introduced Dean not as a surprise guest, but as my partner, my friend. That single phrase carried history with it. It acknowledged something the world had never stopped wondering about, whether the bond had been real or merely professional chemistry. In that moment, the answer was undeniable. Dean, still adjusting to the intensity of the spotlight, leaned toward the microphone with a familiar half-smile, but it lacked the usual detachment. "It's good to see you, Jer," he said quietly. The words were simple, yet their weight was unmistakable. Jerry nodded, unable to speak for a second, then joked about how long Dean had taken to return his calls. The laughter that followed felt less like scripted comedy and more like relief. It signaled that humor, the language they had once spoken fluently, had not been erased by time. When the band began playing an old tune associated with their partnership, the years seemed to collapse briefly. Dean's voice, warm and steady, filled the room. Jerry slipped instinctively into playful exaggeration, feigning swoons and mock interruptions just as he had decades earlier. The audience laughed and cried simultaneously, witnessing a fragment of history resurrected for 3 fleeting minutes. It was not a full revival of Martin and Lewis. It was something gentler, a reminder that the foundation had never been completely destroyed. After the cameras cut to commercial break and the segment concluded, the 2 men stepped off stage into the controlled chaos of backstage corridors. Crew members avoided intruding, sensing the fragility of the moment. Jerry's energy, fueled by adrenaline during the broadcast, began to settle into exhaustion. Dean guided him toward a quieter corner, away from microphones and applause. For the first time that evening, they stood without an audience. The silence between them felt different now, not strained but uncertain in a new way. 20 years of pride and miscommunication do not evaporate in a single embrace. Jerry spoke first, his voice softer than it had been under the lights. He admitted that seeing Dean walk out had felt unreal, as though memory itself had taken physical form. Dean responded with honesty that surprised even him. He confessed that fear had kept him away as much as anger ever had. Fear of reopening wounds, fear of being rejected again, fear of discovering that what they once shared could no longer exist. Jerry listened carefully. For years, he had carried his own narrative of what had gone wrong, assumptions about ego, ambition, and perceived betrayal. Hearing Dean articulate vulnerability shifted that narrative. It reframed their separation not as a villain and victim story, but as 2 men overwhelmed by success and unable to communicate through it. The pressures of fame had magnified insecurities neither had known how to voice in the 1950s. The world had seen glamour. They had experienced strain. They talked in measured tones, acknowledging the jealousy that had grown between them during their rise. Dean admitted feeling overshadowed by Jerry's creative dominance in interviews and public praise. Jerry admitted envying Dean's natural composure and the effortless admiration he received from audiences. Neither confession was dramatic, yet both were necessary. The honesty carried more power than any televised reunion could. As the telethon continued around them, raising funds and applause in equal measure, the 2 former partners spoke not as performers, but as aging men reflecting on lost time. Dean remarked that silence can become habit if allowed to linger too long. Jerry nodded, admitting that pride had become easier than vulnerability. They both understood that 20 years could not be undone, but neither wanted the remaining years to pass in similar quiet. When they eventually returned to the main stage for closing acknowledgments, something subtle had changed. Their body language no longer suggested strangers navigating an unexpected encounter. There was familiarity again, cautious but genuine. The audience interpreted it as magic. In reality, it was forgiveness unfolding in real time. Later that night, after the broadcast ended and guests filtered out into the Las Vegas air, Dean and Jerry found themselves seated together at a small table in a quiet lounge. The noise of the casino floor hummed faintly in the distance. No cameras remained, no applause lingered. It was here, without spectacle, that reconciliation deepened. They shared stories of the years apart, family milestones, personal setbacks, professional triumphs achieved without the other's presence. Each story carried a hint of regret, not for success, but for absence. Dean confessed that there had been nights he almost picked up the phone. Jerry admitted he had drafted letters never sent. The truth was painfully simple. Neither had known how to initiate repair without appearing weak. Yet as they sat there decades later, weakness seemed less frightening than wasted time. They agreed that whatever had once driven them apart no longer held authority over the present. When Dean finally rose to leave, the air between them felt lighter than it had in 20 years. They embraced once more, not for the public, but for themselves. It was not a dramatic cinematic ending. It was quieter, steadier. Jerry watched Dean walk away with a sense of gratitude that eclipsed bitterness. Dean, stepping into the Nevada night, they felt something he had not expected: relief. The reunion did not instantly restore their partnership to its former intensity. They would not return as a full-time act, nor attempt to recreate the exact chemistry of youth. But the wall between them had cracked permanently. Phone calls followed in the months after. Occasional dinners, shared laughter without cameras. What had once been fractured beyond repair began to resemble something familiar again, not identical to the past, but rooted in the same foundation. The world remembered that night for its spectacle: the surprise entrance, the 6 words, the tears. But what truly mattered unfolded in quieter conversations afterward. It was there, away from applause, that resilience revealed itself. Forgiveness is rarely loud. It often begins with acknowledgement and grows through humility. For Dean and Jerry, that humility arrived not in their prime, but in their later years, when pride no longer seemed worth the cost. The stage had given them fame, silence had given them distance. But honesty, late though it came, gave them back something neither had fully lost: brotherhood. The years they couldn't get back. In the weeks following that unexpected reunion on the telethon stage, the world treated it like a miracle that had arrived neatly packaged for television. Headlines called it historic. Commentators described it as emotional closure. Audiences replayed the footage of Dean Martin walking out beneath the bright lights and speaking 6 simple words that cracked open 2 decades of silence. But what the public saw as a completed chapter was, for Dean and Jerry Lewis, only the beginning of something far more delicate. Reconciliation is rarely instantaneous. It is not a switch that flips. It is a slow reconstruction of trust, brick by brick, memory by memory, after years of distance have hardened into habit. Dean returned home after the telethon feeling lighter than he had in years, but also unsettled. Applause fades quickly. Cameras shut off. What remains is the quiet reality of rebuilding something fragile. He found himself staring at the telephone again in the days that followed, this time not out of avoidance, but consideration. For 20 years he had trained himself not to dial a certain number. Now the number existed in his mind like an unfinished sentence. When the call finally came, it was not dramatic. Jerry's voice sounded familiar, slightly cautious, as if both men were testing whether the bridge they had crossed publicly could support private conversation. They began slowly. At first the exchanges were brief, checking in, referencing the telethon, laughing about the way Sinatra had orchestrated the surprise. But beneath the humor lay recognition that something important had shifted. Pride had once acted as a barrier, but now it felt smaller, almost unnecessary. Dean admitted that stepping onto that stage had terrified him more than any premiere or opening night ever had. Jerry confessed that seeing Dean again had felt like being handed back a part of himself he thought he had lost permanently. They did not attempt to analyze the past immediately. Instead, they reintroduced themselves gently, allowing familiarity to re-emerge without force. As months passed, they met occasionally in person, away from publicity. Dinners were quiet, unannounced. There were no photographers outside, no headlines the next day. They talked about their families, about the way the industry had changed, about aging in a profession that celebrates youth. At times, laughter came easily, especially when they revisited stories from their early years, the chaotic backstage pranks, the nights when improvisation saved a show, the thrill of building something new together. Other moments were heavier. They addressed the misunderstandings that had grown unchecked in the 1950s, the interviews that had deepened insecurities, the silence that had seemed easier than vulnerability. Dean admitted that during their partnership he had often felt invisible in Jerry's shadow. Praised primarily for his singing, while Jerry was labeled the creative force. Jerry listened without defensiveness this time. He acknowledged that ambition and pressure had made him oblivious to how his intensity affected the partnership. He confessed that he had envied Dean's effortless presence and natural rapport with audiences. Each confession reframed their history not as betrayal, but as immaturity magnified by success. They had been young, overwhelmed, and unprepared for the machinery of fame that elevated them faster than they could emotionally adapt. There were moments when the weight of lost time pressed heavily on both men. 20 years meant missed milestones, missed phone calls, missed comfort during personal hardships. They did not dwell on regret endlessly, but neither did they dismiss it. Instead, they allowed themselves to acknowledge it honestly. The telethon reunion had not erased the years apart, it had illuminated them. Yet in that illumination came gratitude. They had been given another chance, one not defined by box office numbers or television ratings, but by simple connection. Their renewed friendship did not attempt to recreate the exact dynamic of Martin and Lewis at its peak. They were no longer the young performers fueled by restless ambition. They were older men who understood that what once felt competitive now seemed trivial. When they occasionally appeared together in small public settings, the chemistry remained recognizable, but softer. It carried history rather than hunger. Audiences sensed it immediately. The laughter felt warmer. The glances between them conveyed familiarity unmarred by tension. Privately, Dean experienced a subtle shift in how he approached his own solitude. The house that had once felt heavy with silence no longer seemed as isolating. Knowing that the door between him and Jerry was open again eased something internal. He did not call constantly, nor did Jerry, but the possibility of connection mattered more than frequency. Sometimes resilience is not about dramatic change, but about restoring access to what once felt unreachable. As the late 1970s gave way to the 1980s, life continued delivering its share of joys and sorrows. Personal losses affected both men deeply. In those moments, the value of reconciliation became clearer. Grief feels different when carried alone. They did not always articulate support in sentimental terms, but presence spoke louder than declarations. A phone call during a difficult week. A quiet visit without fanfare. These gestures reinforced that the bond they once feared irreparable still held. Looking back on the reunion years later, Jerry would describe it not as spectacle, but as mercy. Mercy for two stubborn men who had allowed ego to outweigh affection for too long. Dean rarely spoke publicly about regret, but those close to him noticed that he carried less bitterness than before. Forgiveness, once offered, had removed a weight he had not realized he was still holding. The photograph from that telethon night eventually found a permanent place in Jerry's personal collection. It captured the exact second Dean stepped forward and spoke the 6 words that bridged decades. But the real story was not confined to that frozen image. It lived in the conversations that followed, in the humility required to admit fault, in the shared laughter that returned gradually rather than explosively. It lived in the understanding that reconciliation is not about reclaiming the past. It is about honoring it while choosing not to repeat its mistakes. As years passed and health challenges emerged, both men became more reflective. Success had once been measured in applause and headlines. Now it felt measured in relationships restored and words spoken before it was too late. They could not rewrite the 20 years of silence, but they could prevent further silence from taking root. That choice became their quiet act of resilience. When Dean's life eventually reached its final chapter, Jerry felt the loss not only of a former partner, but of a friend reclaimed. He would later speak of the telethon reunion as one of the most meaningful moments of his life, not because it drew massive ratings, but because it gave them time. Time to forgive, time to laugh again, time to acknowledge love that had never fully disappeared. The 6 words Dean spoke that night were not eloquent or elaborate. They were simple. Yet simplicity often carries the greatest truth. The years they could not get back remained a reality, but they no longer defined the story. What defined it instead was courage. The courage to step onto a stage after 20 years of silence, to admit pride had done damage, and to choose connection over ego. For Dean and Jerry, that courage did not restore youth or undo mistakes, but it restored something more valuable: peace. The 6 words that outlived the applause. As the years moved quietly forward, the telethon reunion gradually shifted from headline to memory. Footage replayed occasionally in retrospectives about classic television, but for Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, the true meaning of that night lived far beyond what audiences had witnessed. The cameras had captured tears and laughter, but they could not capture the subtle internal recalibration that followed. What changed was not just their public narrative. It was the way they understood time, pride, and the fragile nature of human connection. Dean had always been a man of restraint. His charm thrived on understatement, his humor on relaxed detachment. Yet in private conversations during the years after the reunion, there were moments when he allowed more honesty than before. He did not dwell on regret publicly, but those close to him noticed a shift. He no longer dismissed the past with indifference. Instead, he acknowledged it as something that had shaped him. The silence between him and Jerry had once felt immovable, a permanent fracture. Now it felt like a lesson learned at great cost. There was an unspoken understanding that reconciliation had not erased the lost years, but it had prevented more from being wasted. Jerry, for his part, carried the reunion like a restored photograph tucked carefully into his memory. He spoke of it often in interviews when asked about defining moments, but not with theatrical exaggeration. He described it as necessary, as overdue, as something that reminded him that even the brightest partnerships can dim when ego is allowed to grow unchecked. He admitted that ambition had once overshadowed gratitude, that competition had crept in where collaboration once flourished. And those admissions were not attempts to rewrite history. They were acknowledgments that growth requires reflection. The friendship they rebuilt was not the same explosive chemistry of their youth. It was quieter, steadier, and rooted in awareness. They no longer needed to outshine one another or prove anything to the industry. Occasional dinners, phone calls, and shared appearances carried warmth without urgency. They understood that what mattered now was not reinvention, but presence. Each conversation was less about career and more about life, family, aging, health, and the strange experience of watching new generations discover their old films. There were times when they revisited the early years, the Glass Hat Club, the improvisations that made them famous, the nights when laughter felt endless. And they did so not to relive glory, but to honor the bond that had existed beneath it. They both recognized that their partnership had been rare, almost alchemical. Chemistry cannot be manufactured, and they had stumbled into it at exactly the right moment in history. Losing it had felt like losing a part of themselves. Regaining even a fragment of that connection later in life felt like grace. As age brought its inevitable challenges, the significance of that telethon reunion deepened. Time, once taken for granted, became more precious. Pride, once defended fiercely, seemed trivial by comparison. Dean remained publicly reserved about sentiment, yet those closest to him observed that the reunion had softened something within him. He did not seek out grand emotional gestures, but he no longer avoided difficult conversations. The armor he had worn for decades fit more loosely now. When Dean passed away in 1995, the world mourned the icon, the smooth voice, the effortless cool, the timeless entertainer. But Jerry mourned the brother he had almost lost twice, once to pride and once to time. In interviews afterward, Jerry reflected not on the 20 years of silence as much as on the years regained after the telethon. He expressed gratitude that they had found their way back before it was too late. That gratitude carried weight. It was not nostalgia, it was relief. In the years following Dean's passing, Jerry often kept a photograph from that telethon night nearby. It showed two men embracing beneath stage lights, the audience blurred behind them. On the surface, it was a moment of celebrity reunion. Beneath it, and it symbolized something universal, the courage to admit fault, the humility to forgive, and the resilience to rebuild what once seemed irreparable. When asked what those 6 words truly meant, "I think it's about time, don't you?" Jerry would smile softly. He would explain that they were not just about stepping back onto a stage. They were about stepping back into honesty, about deciding that silence had lasted long enough. The 6 words outlived the applause because they addressed something larger than show business. They spoke to anyone who has allowed distance to harden into habit, anyone who has mistaken pride for strength, anyone who has postponed reconciliation under the illusion that there will always be more time. Dean's words carried no elaborate apology, no dramatic confession. They were simple and sincere, which made them powerful. Simplicity, when authentic, often cuts deeper than rhetoric. In the final years of his own life, Jerry occasionally reflected on how easily the reunion might never have happened. A missed phone call, a refusal, another year of silence. The thought unsettled him. It reinforced a lesson he would share whenever asked. Do not wait. Relationships are fragile and time is indifferent. The courage to mend them rarely feels convenient, but it is almost always worth the discomfort. The legacy of Martin and Lewis endures in film archives and recorded performances, but perhaps its most meaningful chapter unfolded long after their peak fame. It unfolded in humility, in forgiveness, and in the willingness to say 6 words that bridged 2 decades. Their story reminds us that resilience is not only about enduring hardship, and it is about choosing connection over ego when given the chance. Long after the telethon footage faded into history, those 6 words remained. They were written not only in memory, but in action. The action of showing up despite fear, of speaking despite pride, of embracing despite uncertainty. The applause ended that night in 1976. The lights dimmed, the stage cleared, but the decision to step forward and speak lingered far beyond it. And in the end, that decision became the part of their story that mattered most.